We've now reached the end of our course. I intended from the beginning to be provocative, as only through focusing our attention on contentious issues can we appreciate the challenge of the past and use it as an illumination for the present. From the Middle Ages, when we saw the world born of chaos, political fragmentation, economic contraction and danger, to the growth of long-distance trade and urban life, we have stressed the creation of what we can call culture, or more broadly, a civilization, hence the title of this course. We then assessed the engines of change which moved Europe into a different period of development, the challenge to a universal church, the rise of new religions as ideologies that permitted and justified, even celebrated change, breaking forever the static worldview evident in much medieval thought and institutions. We have seen how this moment of fundamental change was not universally accepted. Indeed, how minor elaborations in theology or the demands of different social classes and political structures resulted in a century of bloody conflict, the wars of religion. The wars of religion then represent the first example of how the continent divided over ideological positions, manifested in competing political, economic, and social, as well as religious systems. And the effects were terrible. Nevertheless, after the 30 Years' War, something good did emerge. The principle of the General Multilateral Peace Conference, the Peace of Westphalia, the ancestor of the Congress of Vienna, the Peace of Versailles, and even the United Nations. The advent of the scientific revolution gave the Enlightenment an opportunity to redefine what it was, not just to be European, but to some extent to put a new perspective on what it was to be human. In fact, in so many ways, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment gave rise to our world. The primacy of reason, science, and the search for some form of objective truth exploded many of the most deeply held beliefs of the continent. But principles such as human rights and human dignity, reflected in John Locke's recognition of life, liberty, and property, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience and of the individual, these things arose to challenge a world still largely governed by structures that denied all of these things. Hence, it took a revolution, in fact, 25 years of revolution and war, to bring these principles into general debate, even if at the end of that period, with the Congress of Vienna and the Restoration, many old ideas continued and the instruments of repression still operated. But not for long. One of the primary elements of freedom is that when it's identified, and especially when it's been experienced, it's extremely difficult to suppress. So the decades that followed the growing liberalization of Europe culminated in the revolutions of 1848 and the creation of ever more liberal democratic parties and eventually liberal democratic states, where the ideals first publicized during the Enlightenment and the French Revolution were domesticated within the context of the European state system. Challenges and change came. They came from the applications of scientific methods in other areas. They came from economic imperatives. The rise of industrial capitalism and industrialization was an even greater revolution on the continent than the one in France in 1789. Industrialization changed the face of the continent in every way, created vast new wealth, new technologies, new opportunities, while simultaneously creating new social classes and urban environments that were so unspeakable that they are difficult for us even to comprehend. What emerged then was another fundamental debate over who should benefit from these changes. How should the fruits of this brave new world be distributed? New ideologies, political parties, and organizations arose to test various theories, defining the political confessions of socialism, liberalism, and redefining conservatism. Although there were violent episodes and many of the working class ideologies were predicated on violence, such as Marxism, what ultimately prevailed were the structures of democracy and the power of the ballot box. This was never a sure thing and was sorely tested, as we've seen. But still, as we can see in Europe today, it did prevail. Science was the precondition for the ideas of Auguste Comte and Saint-Simon, Marx, and liberals. Liberals such as Gladstone or even the Emperor Napoleon III. They all believed in scientific progress, even though their goals were fundamentally different. But it was Darwin and Darwinism that most profoundly shook the mind and culture of Europe, because in that case, the very assumption of what it was to be human was necessarily redefined. And with it, a series of ideas and factions with objectives quite in opposition to the basic principles of European life as it, up to that point, had developed. We can divide the mind, as I suggested, and indeed the experience of Europe into pre- and post-Darwinian halves. So great was his contribution. Wars and terrible political and ideological struggles were waged over different interpretations of On the Origin of Species and the Descent of Man. These debates, in fact, aren't yet altogether settled, as Europeans and others do battle over the nature of what it is to be human and how our basic institutions and principles should reflect or further that essential element. Finally, before adding some thoughts about where I think Europe is going at this moment, I want to explain why I'm ending this course in 1939 once more. The outbreak of the Second World War. My purpose all along has been to discuss Europe on its own terms, from within, so that its intrinsic character and unique experience will emerge. With the Second World War, Europe is no longer a separate entity. It's impossible to discuss Europe without reference to the United States. Not only the events of the war, but more importantly, the post-war years saw the rise in U.S. influence in Europe to a degree that it's inescapable. From the Marshall Plan, one of the great acts of modern statesmanship, to the events of the Cold War. Europe became folded into a broader concept then of the West. And it became a battleground between the two competing ideologies of communism and Western democracy. Although profoundly linked to the events and ideas we've explored in this course, Europe in many ways was no longer autonomous. It is only, as we shall see in a moment, with the collapse of communism that the freedom of the states that once formed the Soviet Union could then emerge and contribute to the development of a new Europe, and in effect, witness, with the collapse of communism and the end of the Soviet Empire, the real end of World War II, with peace treaties finally being signed and borders accepted. It's only now, then, that Europe has once again risen into its own, a process that culminated and is celebrated in the European Union, which has once more changed everything. The journey through European civilization that we've been tracing is in fact a path of a great many ideas and events and individuals who helped define what it was and what it is to be European, and to a degree to be part of Western culture and Western civilization. So many of the ideas that developed on the continent continue to animate modern government. Ideas such as the primacy of law, the role of science and reason, and the need for community, reflected in both state institutions and in personal affective bonds. It's clear from the previous lectures, then, that these principles were not accomplished easily. Many required revolutions, wars, or lengthy political battles to achieve. But there's no doubt but that Europe today is much freer, more open and humane than at almost any time in its troubled history. However, some of the issues chronicled above aren't yet settled, such as the disjunction between faith and reason, and the balance between individual and group rights and responsibilities. Such differences, in fact, can never be finally settled, nor to some extent should they ever be finally settled, because they're living ideas and the context changes. You have to look at these sorts of fundamental questions about the nature of the human condition and the nature of the collective human condition in terms of individual circumstance and the time in which the question is asked. Political parties represent one side or another, and these parties often alternate in power, which is a good thing because citizens can make informed choices and also at the same time retain their right to change their minds. Certain elements in any society will occasion dialogue or disagreement rather than consensus. There's still elements in Europe who favor institutionalizing traditional beliefs, such as Christianity, in the new structures of the continent, such as the Constitution of the European Union. There was a great debate where Poland and also the Church, the Catholic Church under the Pope, suggested that the principle of Christianity should be noted as informing the Constitution of the European Union. Well, this was rejected because there were others for whom the concept of a secular state is so deeply entrenched in its institutions and history that such a recognition could never be permitted. Pernicious emotions, such as extreme nationalism, continue to threaten the peace, not only of Europe, but in fact of the world. Nationalism is not unique to Europe, although it arose there first, at least in our understanding of the term. It's influenced the development of states outside the continent and again pitted nation against nation in an attempt to define some kind of local accommodation in a very complex world. But even in Europe itself, nationalism in its most virulent form has arisen once more in states whose development had been derailed by oppressive dictatorships. We had hoped, in fact, we had in so many ways believed that some of these elements of extreme nationalism had been finally put to rest with the events of the Second World War. Well, this is not the case. The war in the former Yugoslavia was one of the worst moments of post-war Europe, and Europe failed to deal well with the crisis, despite the continent's experience of this most dangerous of emotions. It was distressing to hear and to see once more expressed concepts like racial cleansing, widespread, indeed indiscriminate mass murder driven by nationalist, religious, or political beliefs. This was something we had all hoped we would never see again. But we did. This indicates that some of the consequences of the European experiment continue to mutate, and often in virulent forms to threaten the stability and the security of the continent. Powerful ideologies that Europe had largely rejected, such as communism, continue to thrive in areas to which they had been exported, while others, such as fascism, have largely been relegated to the dustbin of history, thankfully. An irony is that ideas that have declined in Europe have taken root elsewhere, often in new and metastasized forms. The Marxism developed by a German in England in the mid-19th century and exported throughout the continent until it animated the revolutions of the years during and after the First World War may have decayed on its home continent. In the past decades, formerly mainstream purely communist parties have withered or transformed themselves into newly constituted democratic parties of the left, to use the Italian example and the name of the former Italian Communist Party. But Marxist-Leninist parties and Marxist-Leninist principles have found powerful ideological followers in the former colonial areas of the world, to which they had been brought by Western individuals, or where those individuals from the colonies had learned them in Europe, as in the case of Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. They had moved to Asia, to Africa, and they took deep root in places such as China. The Marxism practiced in these non-European environments is now removed from the pure thought of Marx, often reflecting the cult of the leader, whether that leader was Mao Zedong or Kim Il-sung. But it remains a potent force still. Fortunately, other particularly odious ideas, such as fascism, have been rejected on the continent, with only a very, very few disciples, all of whom offer some slight variations in the creed. But this ideology, too, traveled off the continent, but fortunately failed to set down deep roots, although it did inform brutal military dictatorships and cults of personality in practice, if not in ideology, in certain places, for example, in South America. Racial theory, so closely and largely unfairly associated with Charles Darwin, also continues to operate, not only in Europe, but everywhere. The principles of racial superiority or privilege are hard to suppress, given the complexity of the practices and principles derived from 19th century European thought. What we too often see is the construction of groups of marginalized individuals whose only claim to any advantage is race, much, of course, to the discomfort of those around them. Still, great strides have been made in ending such prejudice, but as we've seen, conflict and instability tend to reinforce these ideas even now. Although it's appropriate to celebrate the ennobling ideas and actions of Europeans over the past centuries, we equally must recoil from their failures and reinterpret fundamental beliefs of the past to protect the future. The great wars and the events of the 20th century have largely exploded the belief in progress as an article of faith. Today, most educated observers note that things change and that the error of applying the value judgment of improve is usually quickly exposed. Things, however, have improved. They've improved in so many ways. We simply have to look about the way those in the 19th century looked about them. Medical care, knowledge of the universe, our sense of responsibility for the planet. These, in fact, are improvements. But it's not the 19th century law of acceleration or the almost scientific belief in the necessity of progress, that naive belief of Whig history that we will continue to improve until ultimately we will reach a kind of perfection. We're more and more unsure, and we're tentative than our European ancestors had been in the 18th century during the Enlightenment and the 19th century during the period of Scientism and progress, because we've seen that civilization can be reversed as well as advanced, and the events of the 20th century have indicated that altogether too powerfully. No reasonable person could explain the carnage of the trenches, the Holocaust, or the atrocities of the Gulag as anything but a denial of progress and civilization, as well as a rejection of the good principles that gave Europe its dignity. Through such horrors, we've lost some of our self-confidence, to be sure, but it's to be hoped that we gain maturity and perspective, particularly in the knowledge that we can never allow anything remotely similar to occur again. The great debates of Europe, which animated the continent from the Middle Ages, are not altogether resolved then. What is the ideal balance between individual freedom and community needs? Who determines the greatest good for the greatest number? That utilitarian principle so effectively defined by Bentham and Mill. But what is the factor? What are the elements that ultimately will make that decision clear for all members of any society? What are the responsibilities of the community to its members, especially the weakest? How does the community take responsibility for those who cannot fully care for themselves? What is a fair amount of the distribution of wealth to ensure that those who have a great deal will provide some measure of dignity to those who have not enough? These are questions that will continually be asked because the context changes. And finally, what constitutes a nation? What is a nation? Is it the political borders? Is it the form of government? Is it the ethnicity? Is it the history? Is it the language? What constitutes a nation? This is a question that probably will never be answered, and all answers will be determined by a set of variables that are very, very much contextual, depending on the circumstances of the time when the question itself is asked. These questions, then, are still part of a European debate, a debate that's rehearsed elsewhere in the world, although much of it began largely, as we've seen, in Europe. But fortunately in Europe, the debate is sustained by free and open discussion and witnessed through the ballot box, with parties adopting one elaboration or another of these principles, and individual citizens then choosing which one they wish to support. And as we've seen, this fundamental right to choose and witness or vote for your choice was very dearly acquired over the period of a century. European societies are extraordinarily complex. They have very, very complex histories, and as a result, they're not as flexible as some should think they might be. France is a fine example, especially as we read the daily newspapers. France institutionalized secularism, first during the French Revolution, and again in the first decade of the last century after the Dreyfus affair. This principle is regarded by most Frenchmen as part of their national self-definition. La laïcité is part of being a citizen of France. It is written in the Constitution. It defines the nature of French culture and the relationship of French citizens to their community. But to some newcomers, forbidden to wear headscarves or veils in schools or government offices, and many would like to say on the street because the streets in France are public places, it seems like oppression. To what degree then should old Europe make accommodation for newcomers who were not part of the history and the tradition that gave rise to the definition of those principles initially? To what extent does community trump individual freedom of expression? And what constitutes legitimate freedom of expression? Extraordinarily difficult and complex questions, not easily answered. And what's more, the answer, as I suggested, will always change, depending on context. Terror cells active in Europe have challenged the deep European commitment to freedom of speech. The principle, remember, that Diderot argued gave reality to every other freedom and right. The Enlightenment always said the fundamental platform on which all human rights are built is the freedom of speech, because without that, all of the other freedoms will eventually corrode and wither away. One of the ironies is that much of the pressure to limit restrictions on the public witnessing for religious beliefs comes not from the Christian majority, but from the minority groups of recent immigrants to Europe, who in their culture cannot separate religion from self-definition. Their personal, family, collective, and political worldviews deny any accommodation with the secular, resulting in often marginalized communities living within, but apart from, mainstream European culture, whether in Holland or in France or in Germany or almost any other state. Occasionally, these groups lash out in violence, often exacerbated by economic and social marginalization, against a Europe they cannot accept or even comprehend. Even liberals say the problem is theirs. They refuse to become part of the system. They marginalize themselves. But their belief system demands the representatives of this secular world be punished and that they separate themselves out so they're not infected by these ideas. Well, this is not quite a clash of civilizations, but it's something close to it. We simply have to note the examples in Europe of the recent past. The fatwa against Salman Rushdie for putting the Prophet Muhammad as a character in one of his novels, the violence over Danish cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, and the murder of a Dutch filmmaker for using verses of the Quran in ways not deemed acceptable. What we see in this most essential way is a collision of two articles of faith, one European, largely secular, based upon secular principles, based upon a definition of the community that's essentially rational, and one non-European, which is essentially religious or faith-based, and where rationalism plays a very minor role in comparison to what is believed to be revealed divine truth. Free speech, though, is among the most deeply held rights that emerged from the Enlightenment. And Europeans will never compromise that right, regardless of the threat. And we have seen this with the examples that I've just given you. Why? Because they've seen too much from oppressive regimes, and they've seen the horrors of the totalitarian dictatorships of the 20th century. Free speech, they realized, was the first element sacrificed by their community during those moments of horror. Had free speech operated more effectively, it's quite possible that the horror may have been mitigated. We can't say. It's not history. It didn't happen. But nevertheless, the commitment to free speech and freedom of expression is so deep as to be unassailable. To compromise free speech, then, would be to negate what it means to be a European, and also would not honor the tens of millions of people who died for principles such as free speech and freedom of association and freedom to represent yourself in whichever way you choose, but always within the confines of a set of common values that the entire community agrees to and will be willing to protect. Moreover, this very confrontation reveals the new Europe, at least from the Middle Ages. The migration of peoples in Europe has always been exclusively from elsewhere within the continent. Europe is a place of migration where individuals will move within the continent, but very recently there has been another force at work. Europe has been an exporter of population around the world, as we in North America and South America and Australia and elsewhere can attest. Now, though, those coming to Europe are not Europeans. Those who are coming, Europe is importing people from what had been their overseas colonies. And these come, as I said, with very different values and carry a very different kind of baggage. They bring with them the attitudes and traditions of their former homes, and even, to some extent, the political conflicts, which they continue from their new homes in Europe. This, too, complicates the life of the continent, as Europeans are forced to deal with the realities of immigrant communities where once, very recently, there were none, and where the very existence of these groups challenges the very basic principles of European civilization, since at least the Enlightenment. And as the European birth rate is amongst the lowest in the entire world, this problem is not going to be solved easily. will not be solved through assimilation or acculturation over time, but will grow ever more visible and will require a solution that ultimately will accommodate different perspectives within the traditions of European freedom. Thus, Europeans face a challenge for which their culture and their history have not prepared them. Until just decades ago, the great powers of the continent enjoyed vast empires where they were supreme. Now they have to face their former colonists as fellow citizens. It's hoped, of course, that this new reality will forever consign 19th century ideas of racial supremacy and Christian exclusivity illustrated by missionary activity and European triumphalism to history. And the richness of the experience and the culture of the immigrants will be seen eventually to enrich Europe profoundly and make Europe a much more interesting and much more complex and attractive place. But it's not a sure thing. European society then is still changing and will have to develop new ideas, practices, and mechanisms to address problems that had not been foreseen and had not been part of the European experience when Europeans exported surplus population and not allowed for a huge amount of immigration to fill the vacuum that their own low birth rate had created. But I at least remain sanguine, because what is still evident in European civilization is something that I hope has emerged from these lectures. The principles animating European affairs are not absolute or fixed, but dependent on context. Although dangerous, again, as we've seen, it's evident that Europe has become too complex a place to be doctrinaire. The variety of experience we've traced in the past lectures has provided a rich source of ingenuity and positive virtue, and a great many examples of dangers to be avoided. And Europeans will have to find their own solutions to their own problems in their own way, according to their own traditions. Europe is very different from the United States. This is an obvious and somewhat simple-minded statement, but it must be said. In almost every European nation, the role of the state is larger, and certain concepts like public responsibility for regulating private corporations, for public benefit, for protecting individuals from poverty, sickness, or marginalization are all accepted without much debate. Socialist parties are not only mainstream, but hold office across the continent with regularity, and all political voices, including the far left, are respected. Secularism and purely secular concepts of morality and freedom operate as social adhesives, making religion, the private lives of politicians, and individual private practices of no interest to anyone except those involved. Europe developed differently over a long time and was driven by different principles. But again, as with progress, it's not useful. In fact, it's foolish to make value judgments as to which is better or more progressive. Let it stand that they're different. And this should be the platform of informed debate, insightful to both. Community, the individual, culture, the state, freedom, and responsibility mean very different things on the continent, although we all use the same words. Winston Churchill's witty remark that the British and the Americans are two people divided by a common language remains true. Europe is called the violent continent, and much of what we've been discussing here reinforces that description. It was a crucible of fire, but from this shared experience has arisen a new idea of Europe. Beginning with a narrow agreement on tariffs on coal and steel in the Treaty of Rome in 1957, the European Union is now a federated union of 27 sovereign states. It embraces much of the continent in an economic and loose political association that stretches from the borders of Russia to the Atlantic, from the far north to Malta, halfway between Sicily and Africa. This dream was achieved through the positive power of democracy, human rights, and liberal legislation, rather than through religion, war, and ideology. With a population approaching 500 million and some of the most powerful economies in the world, the European Union, if successfully managed, will change the shape of world politics. What is interesting in the context of this course is how the old concept of a united Europe appears again and again. Europe was united in various ways and forms under the Roman Empire, under the Roman Church, under Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Empire, and briefly under Napoleon. There was then always a sense that Europe was an entity greater than the sum of its parts. Our adventure now is to watch it develop and to see whether the violent continent will become more peaceful and whether the lessons learned over such a long and tumultuous history will prevail. It's been a pleasure walking through the history of Europe with you and to see European civilization develop. I hope you've enjoyed the course, and I look forward to your discussions amongst yourselves about the nature of European civilization, how it applies to your life, and in fact how the lessons that have been learned and seen can in fact be applied to make the world in which we live more comfortable, safer, and fairer, because that, of course, is the responsibility of all of us and an element that forms our common humanity.